So let's start with epidemic. So an epidemic just means an increase in number of cases. So, for example, Los Angeles recently had an epidemic of hepatitis A cases among homeless population. So it just went up above the normal range that you'd expect in any given year. And it was in a geographically localized area. A pandemic means, so the word pan, the prefix pan means everything. So a pandemic affects multiple people all over the globe. So, for example, in 2009, we had the H1N1 pandemic, which affected the globe. And an endemic disease is something that's always there. So the common cold is endemic all over, or Lyme disease is endemic to Pennsylvania. The other thing that's important to remember is when you use the word pandemic, it has all these connotations. People think the end of the world. That doesn't mean anything. It doesn't mean anything like that. Pandemic just means that there's an increase in number of cases all over the world, encompassing the world. It doesn't say anything about severity. And again, I go back to 2009 H1N1 flu pandemic. It wasn't a very severe pandemic, but it was a pandemic nonetheless. And you had the media saying, this was kind of a dud, but it wasn't a dud. It was still a pandemic by any definition of the word. It's just that people have smuggled in that connotation that it has to be severe, people dying in the street to be called a pandemic. So that's an important thing to keep distinct in your mind, that severity doesn't have anything to do with whether something is a pandemic or an epidemic.
You were talking about in the beginning about how pandemics have shaped history. Are you able to talk about that a little bit more?
Sure. So pandemics, because they are so all-encompassing and because many of them are very severe, have really left huge dents in the human population. So let's take, for example, the 1918 flu, which were just 100 years ago. If you look at human lifespan, it's going up, 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 and then a dip, and then goes like that. For the 1918 flus, it left a mark on lifespan in the United States. So this is something that really has the ability to change the course of history. So in 1918, you had people in the prime of life dying. That really takes a toll on a society. And that's just one example. If you look at the Black Death, the pandemic that happened in Europe in the 1400s, 1/3 of the population was killed. Of Europe. Of Europe was killed.
1/3.
Yes, that changed to cause major societal disruption, major structural changes that have occurred. I think that when you look at those two things, those are two good examples of how a pandemic changes things. And when we looked at 2014 in Ebola, it wasn't a pandemic; it was an epidemic in West Africa of Ebola. You had states almost topple because of that, because there was so much unrest, so much societal disruption going on. So when you have an out-of-control infectious disease, it really breaks down many of the structures in society. And because infectious diseases, for the most part, don't have boundaries. They don't care what someone's socioeconomic impact, socioeconomic
they don't have borders.
Right, they don't have borders between people. Anybody can be infected. It really creates a lot of issues. And people, when you're dealing with a contagious infectious disease, people have this element of fear. They're scared. Anytime there's a natural disaster, most people's general thing is to try and help and figure out what's going on. But with an infectious disease outbreak, people's natural inclination is to run. And to stay away from other people. So there's a lot of factors that happen when you have an infectious disease emergency that really can shape the way a country or the world responds to that infection and what it leaves in its wake.
The flu pandemic of, what did you say, 1918? Mm-hmm. How impactful was that? How many people died?
About between 50 and 100 million.
Wow.
In 1 year. How many? So I always ask, this is a rhetorical thing I do sometimes. So how many people have died of HIV?
I don't know.
About 35 million over 30 years. But this is 50 to 100 in 1 year.
In 1 year.
Yeah, so that's a very different thing that we're talking about. We call these things global catastrophic biological events, something like the 1918 flu. Very different than HIV, which has taken a horrible toll on people. But it was over a long period of time. It was slow. So people had time to adjust to it, to think about it. But if you imagine 100 million people being dead in a year, that really is going to have a completely outsized impact versus any other type of infectious disease event. So
do they have any numbers on how many people were affected by it?
It's probably 5% or so of the world was infected. It was just it's something that is hard because there's not a lot of data there, but we know if you look back at the newspaper reports and some of the medical reports that came out that this was something that really was a seismic event in terms of how it impacted everybody. There were even shortages of coffins because there was nothing to do there, because there was nowhere to bury these people. Bodies were just dumped because there was nowhere to put them after this in the wake of this pandemic. The other issue was that you had other industries like the insurance industry, the hospital industry. All of these people didn't know how to deal with the pandemic because there was huge cascading impact. So, for example, you had people, life insurance companies, having to pay out big premiums because of this, and it really had this cascading impact on many different fields that you really don't get with any other type of medical event. And I think that's something, again, that I keep coming back to with infectious diseases, is that they're so different than any other type of branch of medicine because of what it can do to other industries and other parts of life.
Is this what you call GCBRs?
A GCBR is something that we call, it's a term that my colleagues and I at the think tank I work at, we developed to try and classify the most extreme form of a pandemic, one in which all the means a society has to combat it are outstripped. The private sector, governments, they can't respond to this, where it causes either huge loss of life and major societal disruptions. And the really only one that we've seen that...
Oh, and what does GCBR stand for?
Global Catastrophic Biologic Risk.
Gotcha.
And the only thing that we've ever seen do that really is 1918. That's the closest that's the best thing to keep in mind, because it happens quick, fast, it outstrips all resources, and it really leads to major societal collapse. And I think when you think about 1918 and flu, we know that flu has this capacity to do it. So when you think about global catastrophic biological risks, influenza is always the top of the list because it's done it before, and we are probably not very prepared for flu in 2019. In the same way that we weren't very prepared in 1918. We're better, but there are still many unanswered questions regarding flu and how we'll respond to it, and how to get better at, for example, making vaccines, antivirals, dealing with hospitals. All of that are still open questions, whether we would be able to cope very well in 2019 with a pandemic that is on the scale of the 1918 pandemic.
Well, what is it about certain diseases that are able to spread more than others?
So each infectious disease that's contagious has kind of a continuum of contagiousness. So we talked about diseases that aren't contagious at all, like tetanus, and then something like influenza, which is pretty contagious. And it all has to do with a couple different factors. So one is, how are they spread? So a disease that's spread through the respiratory route, through coughing, sneezing, or breathing, is going to be much more contagious than something that's spread through blood and body fluid. So the most contagious disease known to man is measles, and that's because measles is spread through the airborne route. So just by breathing, you can spread measles. So if I were to leave this room 2 hours later, the air would still be infectious. And that's something that's very advantageous for a virus to be able to spread to people, that it's in the air. When you think about other diseases that are spread, for example, through blood and body fluids like Ebola, they're contagious and you can spread them, but they're never going to reach that scale as an airborne or a respiratory spread virus. So when you think about how are things contagious, it really has to do with how they're transmitted. And that's something, anytime a new virus appears or a new bacterial infection, you think, how is it spreading between person to person? And if it's in the air, that becomes very, very dangerous compared to if it's only in blood and body fluids, because you can intervene with the blood and body fluids. You tell people, wear a condom, don't share needles if you're injecting drugs, wear gowns and gloves if you're cleaning up body waste from people. You can't do that with breathing. It's very hard to get people to wear masks, and they don't even work most of the time with some of the particles being so small. Or if something is spread, for example, through sewage, you can say, let's do some sanitation type of stuff. Let's get people's drinking water cleaner. You can do that kind of stuff, but you cannot do that with an airborne infection. And that's why those rise to the highest level of pandemic threat when you think about ranking these types of pathogens and types of what can cause a pandemic.
And I imagine that some diseases probably don't show symptoms right away. Is that right?
Right. Some diseases have long, what we call incubation periods, and some diseases you are contagious during that incubation period. So in many studies and modeling studies looking at control of infectious diseases, if a disease is contagious during its incubation period, when you don't have any symptoms at all, so you've not changed your behavior, those are very, very hard to control. And a great example of that is influenza. Influenza, you're contagious one day before symptoms. So you can go out and be around doing stuff and spreading the disease without even having any symptoms. And the other thing is also some diseases have very mild symptoms in certain individuals that don't change their activities of daily living. because they're going out and they're doing stuff, so they're spreading it, and maybe they're going to cause severe disease in somebody else. So that whole spectrum of illness that you can get from an infection serves to spread many diseases, and especially the respiratory ones like flu and measles, where people can go out and do things.
Well, and you've said that human activity can help enhance pandemic potential.
Right. There's lots of ways to put that. So human activity, for example, just by doing things that nobody's done before. So we talk about certain high-risk populations. So, for example, bushmeat hunters in Africa who are butchering primates for food. That can sometimes expose them to viruses that are more likely to be able to infect humans, because humans are part of the primate group of animals. So that's one way that you can expose yourself. Or people working in butcher shops. That's one way to do it. Also, there's something completely different. This, what I call kind of the return of the primitive, where people who don't get vaccines, that actually helps spread pandemics, or who drink raw milk, which isn't pasteurized, that can spread infections as well. There are lots of things you can do that way. Then there is the intentional, bio-terrorism, where we've seen people try to weaponize many viruses. That can also cause a problem as well. And then also some of those labs that are working on these things can have accidents, and things can spread out of a lab. So there's many ways that humans can enhance pandemic potential. And another good example is in 2003, we had the SARS outbreak in China, which was basically covered up by the Chinese government, allowed to fester and spread before it actually came to notice, and basically circled the globe, caused 8,000 cases, and with about a 10% mortality rate, and led to about $34 billion in economic losses, with empty airports all over the world.
How can you tell me more about that? I actually don't. I know SARS. I remember hearing the headlines or seeing the headlines, but I don't know if I knew the details very much.
So SARS is a virus. It's part of a group called coronaviruses, and for the most part, they'd only been characterized as causing the common cold. And what happened in China was a special virus, the SARS virus, basically spread from bats into other animals. And one of the animals was called the civet cat. And this civet cat was a delicacy, and people were eating it. And certain people ate it and got this new virus. And the virus was a common cold type of virus, so it spread through the air. And certain individuals that got infected were disproportionate spreaders of the virus, kind of like typhoid Marys. And that allowed this virus to really explode in certain parts of the world. And in China, when these cases first occurred, the Chinese government was very reticent to let anybody know about this. This tends to be a theme with infectious diseases, that countries don't want to say that this is going on in their country. So it was covered up, and eventually it actually got leaked through kind of an email listserv that this was going on. And but by that time, it was too late, because some of those people that got infected had gone to conferences, had gone to meetings. Famously, a doctor had went to Hong Kong to a medical conference, and then infected other doctors, who then spread all over. No. And we had cases in Canada. We had the city of Toronto really under siege with SARS. And thankfully, it only had a 10% mortality rate. And we figured out what to do to stop it, which was really better infection control in hospitals, because it was exploiting healthcare facilities where people might be getting oxygen, might be getting certain drugs nebulized down there, what will be the asthma type of drugs that were kind of being aerosolized down, that was spreading the virus all over. After we figured out that was the issue and stopped it, and then stopped people from eating the palm civet cat, that outbreak basically was over. But that really was one of the examples in the modern world of what a respiratory virus could do. Because $34 billion of economic losses is not small, and you had major disruptions with travel, and there are pictures of airports that were completely barren because people were afraid to fly because of this virus being present.
Hey everyone, thanks so much for watching the episode. If you're interested in contributing to the conversation and supporting the show, there's 2 easy things you can do. 1, click subscribe, and 2, visit our Patreon page where you get exclusive access to the Exploring Minds community.